in the annals of American history. Few escape stories are as remarkable or as audacious as that of Henry Box Brown. His journey from enslavement to freedom will become one of the most extraordinary tales of human courage, ingenuity, and the indomitable spirit's quest for liberty. This is a story that defies imagination, yet it is completely true, a testament to what one man was willing to endure for the chance to live as a free human being. Henry Brown was born into slavery around 1815 in Louisa County, Virginia. From his very first breath, he was considered property, not a person. His childhood was spent on a plantation where he witnessed firsthand the cruelties and indignities of the slave system. Like millions of other enslaved people in the American South, Henry had no control over his own destiny, no rights that were legally recognized, and no hope of justice under the law. When Henry was a teenager, his enslaver died, and Henry became the property of the man's son. He was sent to work in Richmond, the capital of Virginia, where he was hired out to a tobacco manufacturing plant. Richmond in the 1830s and 1840s was a bustling commercial center, and the tobacco industry was one of its economic pillars. Enslaved workers like Henry provided the labor that generated enormous profits for white factory owners and enslavers. Working in the tobacco factory was grueling. The days were long, the conditions were harsh, and the work was monotonous and physically demanding. Henry and other enslaved workers would strip tobacco leaves, process them, and prepare them for shipment to markets around the world. Despite the brutality of his circumstances, Henry was known as a capable and reliable worker. But no amount of hard work could change his fundamental status as someone else's property. In Richmond, Henry met a young enslaved woman named Nancy. Despite the impossible circumstances of their lives, they fell in love. Nancy was enslaved by a different owner, which meant that even their relationship existed at the mercy of two separate enslavers. Nevertheless, with their enslaver's permission, because even marriage required permission from those who claimed to own them, Henry and Nancy were wed in a ceremony that had no legal standing, but held deep personal meaning for them both. Henry and Nancy started a family together. They had 3 children, and for a time, Henry dared to hope that they might be able to maintain some semblance of family life, even within the confines of slavery. He worked hard, saved what little money he was allowed to keep, and tried to make the best of an inherently unjust situation. He even attended church regularly, finding solace in faith and the community of other enslaved people who gather for worship. But in 1848, Henry's world came crashing down. Nancy's enslaver, a man named Samuel Cottrell, had fallen into financial difficulties. To settle his debts, Cottrell made a decision to sell Nancy and the children. This was one of the most common and most devastating practices of American slavery, the separation of families for economic gain. Enslaved people lived in constant fear of being sold away from their loved ones, and that fear became Henry's reality. When Henry learned that his wife and children were to be sold, he was desperate. He went to his own enslaver and begged to be allowed to purchase his family's freedom. He offered all the money he had managed to save over the years, but his plea was denied. He rushed to find Nancy before she was taken away. On the streets of Richmond, he caught one final glimpse of his family. Nancy was in chains, walking in a coffle, a line of enslaved people chained together, being marched to the slave markets of North Carolina. Their children walked beside her, too young to fully understand that they would never see their father again. Henry watched helplessly as his entire family disappeared down the road. In that moment, something inside him broke, but also something hardened into resolve. He later wrote that he felt as though his heart had been torn from his chest. The law offered him no recourse. The church offered him no justice. His enslaver offered him no compassion. Nancy and his children were gone, and there was nothing he could do within the system that had enslaved him. For weeks, Henry was consumed by grief and rage. He became, by his own account, nearly suicidal with despair. But gradually, his anguish transformed into determination. If the system would not give him justice, he would have to take his freedom himself. He began to think seriously about escape. Escaping from slavery in the Deep South was extraordinarily dangerous. Virginia had an extensive network of slave patrols, groups of white men who monitored roads and public spaces, checking the papers of any black person they encountered. Free black people were required to carry documentation of their status at all times, and any enslaved person found without written permission from their enslaver could be severely punished. The penalties for attempted escape were brutal: whipping, branding, sale to the even harsher conditions of the Deep South, or even death. Moreover, the Fugitive Slave Act meant that even if an escaped person made it to a northern state where slavery was illegal, they were not truly safe. Slave catchers could pursue fugitives across state lines, and northern law enforcement was required to assist in capturing and returning escaped slaves to their enslavers. The entire apparatus of American law was designed to make escape nearly impossible and to punish those who tried. But Henry was determined to try. He began confiding in people he trusted, seeking advice and assistance. One of the people he approached was a free black man named James Caesar Anthony Smith, who worked as a shoemaker in Richmond. James Smith was sympathetic to Henry's plight and willing to help, but the question remained: how could Henry possibly escape Richmond and travel hundreds of miles to freedom without being caught? The answer came from an unlikely source: a white shoemaker and gambler named Samuel Alexander Smith. Samuel Smith had his own complicated motives. Some historians believe he was motivated by money. Others suggest he had genuine abolitionist sympathies. Whatever his reasons, Samuel Smith agreed to help Henry escape, and together with James Smith, they began to formulate a plan. The plan they devised was almost unthinkable in its audacity. Henry would not try to travel as a fugitive, sneaking through the countryside and hiding from patrols. Instead, he would mail himself to freedom in a shipping crate. He would become cargo, shipped via the commercial transportation networks that connected Richmond to the free states of the North. The idea seems absurd at first consideration. How could a grown man survive being shipped in a box? The journey would take at least a full day, possibly longer, traveling by wagon, railroad, and steamboat. The box would be handled roughly, tossed and turned and stacked with other cargo. It would likely be turned upside down at times. There would be limited air, no light, no way to stretch or move, no way to call for help if something went wrong. But Henry was willing to risk it all. Samuel Smith had the box constructed to Henry's specifications. It was made of sturdy wooden planks, measuring 3 feet long by 2 feet wide by 2.5 feet deep. This gave Henry barely enough room to crouch inside, but not enough to sit up straight or stretch out his legs. The box had 3 small air holes drilled into it, each about an inch wide, to provide ventilation. Inside, Henry would carry a small container of water and a few biscuits to sustain him during the journey. On the outside of the box, Samuel Smith would mark it with the words, "This side up with care," to try to ensure that the box would be handled properly. Of course, there was no guarantee that the handlers would pay attention to these markings, but it was the best they could do. The destination was the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. Samuel Smith had contacted members of the society, and they had agreed to receive the shipment. A man named James Miller McKim, a Presbyterian minister and abolitionist, would be waiting in Philadelphia to receive the mysterious box from Richmond. On the morning of March 23rd, 1849, Henry prepared for his journey. He said goodbye to the few people who knew what he was about to attempt, knowing that he might never see them again, either because he would succeed and reach freedom or because he would die in the attempt. Then he climbed into the wooden box. Samuel Smith nailed the lid shut, sealing Henry inside what could become either a vessel of liberation or a coffin. The box was loaded onto a wagon and transported to the Adams Express Company office in Richmond. From there, it would begin its journey north. Samuel Smith had paid $26 for the shipping, a considerable sum at the time, though immeasurably less than what Henry's life and freedom were worth. The journey that followed was harrowing beyond description. For the next 27 hours, Henry endured conditions that would break most people. The box was tossed onto wagons and railroad cars with no regard for the "this side up" marking. For hours at a time, Henry was turned upside down, the weight of his body pressing on his head and shoulders. He felt as though his eyes would burst from their sockets. The veins in his temples throbbed with dangerous pressure. At one point, the box was loaded onto a steamboat traveling up the Potomac River. 2 men used the box as a seat, sitting on it and conversing for hours while Henry remained motionless inside, barely breathing, terrified that any sound might give him away. Later, The box was thrown roughly onto another wagon, and Henry struck his head hard against the wooden sides. For a moment, he thought he might lose consciousness, which could have been fatal in such confined space. Throughout the entire ordeal, Henry had to remain absolutely silent. Any cry of pain, any call for help, would reveal his presence and likely result in his immediate capture and return to slavery, and probably to a punishment far worse than anything he had yet endured. He controlled his breathing. Despite the limited oxygen, he fought against panic as claustrophobia threatened to overwhelm him. He prayed, both for survival and for the courage to endure whatever came next. The box traveled by wagon to the Richmond depot, then by railroad to Washington, then by steamboat to Baltimore, and finally by railroad again to Philadelphia. At each transfer point, there was a new risk of discovery. Handlers might have heard movement from inside the box. The weight and balance of the box might have aroused suspicion. A customs inspector might have decided to examine the contents. Any one of 100 things could have gone wrong. But somehow, miraculously, the box made it through every checkpoint. On the morning of March 24th, 1849, approximately 27 hours after his journey began, Henry's box arrived at the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society at 107 North 5th Street in Philadelphia. Inside the office, for men had gathered all members of the abolitionist movement. James Miller McKim, the Presbyterian minister, was there, along with William Still, a free black man who was one of the most important figures in the Underground Railroad. Also present were Charles D. Cleveland, a professor and abolitionist, and Lewis Thompson, another member of the society. They had been expecting the shipment, but they were nervous. They had no way of knowing if their plan had succeeded, or they were about to open a box containing a dead body. The men approached the box carefully. They checked to make sure they were alone and that the doors were locked. Then they began to remove the nails from the lid. As they worked, one of them reportedly called out, "All right?" It was a question, a way of asking if anyone was inside, if that person was alive. From inside the box came a weak but clear response. "All right, sir." The men quickly removed the lid and looked inside. There was Henry Brown, drenched in sweat, his clothes soaked through, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes very much alive. He slowly began to unfold himself from the cramped position he had maintained for more than a day. His muscles were stiff, his body ached, but he was alive. He had done it. He had mailed himself to freedom. As Henry climbed out of the box, he reportedly began to sing a hymn of thanksgiving. Despite everything he had endured, his first impulse was to express gratitude for his deliverance. The men who had received him were astonished, moved to tears by what they were witnessing. William Still, who would later become known as the father of the Underground Railroad for his work helping fugitive slaves, would write extensively about this moment, recording it as one of the most remarkable events in the history of the anti-slavery movement. Henry had arrived in Philadelphia as a fugitive slave, but under Pennsylvania law, he was beyond the immediate reach of his enslaver. However, he was not completely safe. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that his former enslaver could still pursue him and attempt to have him returned to Virginia. Henry would need to remain vigilant and eventually move even farther north to secure his safety. But in that moment, as he stood in the office of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, Henry Brown was free. He had risked everything, endured unimaginable suffering, and won his freedom through courage and determination. The men who had received him welcomed him into the community of abolitionists and freedom seekers, and Henry began his new life as a free man. Word of Henry's extraordinary escape spread quickly through abolitionist circles. The story was so remarkable, so audacious, that it captured the imagination of people throughout the North. Here was a man who had literally mailed himself to freedom, who had transformed himself into cargo to escape the bonds of slavery. It was a story that highlighted both the desperate lengths to which enslaved people would go to be free and the creative resistance they employed against their oppression. Henry quickly became known by a new name, Henry Box Brown. The nickname stuck, becoming permanently attached to his identity. While some formerly enslaved people might have resented such a nickname as a reminder of their suffering, Henry embraced it. He understood that his story had power, that it could move hearts and change minds about the institution of slavery. In the months following his escape, Henry became a sought-after speaker on the abolitionist lecture circuit. He traveled throughout the northern states, appearing at anti-slavery meetings and conventions, telling his story to rapt audiences. He was articulate and compelling, and his physical presence, the fact that here was the actual man who had survived this incredible journey, made his testimony all the more powerful. Henry also commissioned the creation of a moving panorama, a popular form of entertainment and education in the 19th century, consisting of a long painted canvas that was slowly scrolled across a stage while a narrator told an accompanying story. Henry's panorama depicted scenes from his life in slavery, his escape in the box, and his arrival in freedom. He traveled with this panorama, presented to audiences, and using it as a tool to educate people about the realities of slavery. In 1849, working with an abolitionist named Charles Stearns, Henry published his narrative. The book was titled Narrative of Henry Box Brown, who escaped from slavery enclosed in a box 3 feet long and 2 wide. It was one of many slave narratives published during this period, first-hand accounts by formerly enslaved people that served as powerful anti-slavery propaganda and as historical documents of immense value. Unfortunately, Henry's success in publicizing his story had unintended consequences. The more famous Henry's escape became, the more attention it drew to the method he had used and to the people who had helped him. Samuel Smith, the white shoemaker who had orchestrated Henry's shipping, attempted to repeat the trick with other enslaved people. In 1849, he tried to ship 2 more individuals to freedom in boxes, but this time the plan was discovered. The enslaved people were captured and returned to their enslavers, and Samuel Smith was arrested, tried, and imprisoned. The publicity surrounding Henry's case also led to the passage of even stricter fugitive slave laws, culminating in the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This law significantly strengthened the ability of enslavers to pursue fugitives in northern states and imposed penalties on anyone who aided escaped slaves. The act created a hostile environment for fugitive slaves throughout the North, and Henry realized that even in Philadelphia, he was no longer truly safe. In 1850, Henry made the difficult decision to leave the United States entirely. He sailed to England, where slavery had been abolished in 1833, and where he would be beyond the reach of American slave catchers. In England, Henry continued his anti-slavery work, performing his panorama shows and lecturing about the evils of American slavery to British audiences. Henry's life in England was complicated. He remarried. His first wife, Nancy, and his children remained enslaved in the United States, their fate unknown, and he had a daughter with his second wife. He continued to perform and lecture, though with less frequency as the years went on. He also became involved in spiritualism and mesmerism, popular movements in Victorian England, and incorporated these elements into his performances. Henry Box Brown lived in England for 25 years. During that time, the American Civil War was fought, slavery was abolished, and the world he had escaped from was fundamentally transformed. In 1875, after the end of Reconstruction, Henry finally returned to the United States. He continued to perform his show occasionally, now adding magic tricks and entertainment elements to appeal to post-war audiences who were less interested in anti-slavery messages. The details of Henry's later life are somewhat unclear. Historical records become sparse, and we don't know with certainty when or where he died. Most historians believe he died sometime in the 1890s, possibly in Toronto, Canada, though this is not definitively confirmed. What we do know is that he lived for decades as a free man, that he never stopped telling his story, and that he contributed to the historical record in ways that continue to resonate today. The story of Henry Box Brown raises profound questions about freedom, resistance, and the human spirit. What does it say about the institution of slavery that a man would risk death by shipping himself in a box rather than continue living in bondage? What does it tell us about the nature of resistance that enslaved people would devise such creative, desperate, and courageous methods of escape? Henry's story also complicates our understanding of the Underground Railroad. We often imagine the Underground Railroad as a network of safe houses and secret passages, with fugitive slaves traveling by night through the wilderness. And certainly, many people did escape that way. But Henry's story reminds us that the paths to freedom were diverse, and that freedom seekers used every means at their disposal, including the very commercial infrastructure of the slave society itself. The box that carried Henry to freedom was eventually donated to the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society and displayed at their meetings. For a time, it served as a tangible symbol of one man's quest for freedom. Unfortunately, the box has been lost to history. We don't know what ultimately became of it, but the story it represents has not been lost. Today, Henry Box Brown is remembered as one of the most iconic figures in the history of American slavery and abolition. His name appears in textbooks, his story is taught in classrooms, and his courage continues to inspire people around the world. Historians value his narrative as an important primary source document that provides insight into the experience of slavery and the psychology of resistance. In Richmond, Virginia, the city where Henry was enslaved and from which he made his daring escape, there are now historical markers commemorating his story. The irony is profound. A city that once was a major center of the domestic slave trade now honors the memory of a man who escaped that system in such a dramatic fashion. Henry Box Brown's story is ultimately about the unconquerable human desire for freedom. Despite living in a system designed to dehumanize and control him, despite losing everything he held dear, despite facing odds that seemed insurmountable, Henry found a way to liberate himself. His method was extreme, dangerous, and nearly fatal, but it worked. His story reminds us that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents in their own liberation. They resisted in countless ways, both large and small, both public and private. Some, like Henry, made dramatic escapes that captured the public imagination. Others resisted through subtle forms of defiance, through preserving their culture and humanity, through creating families and communities even in the most oppressive circumstances. The story of Henry Box Brown also highlights the role of allies in the struggle for freedom. Without James Smith and Samuel Smith, Henry could not have executed his plan. Without the abolitionists who received him in Philadelphia, his journey would have ended in tragedy. The fight against slavery required coalitions across racial lines, even though those coalitions were often complicated and imperfect. As we reflect on Henry's story today, we might consider what it means to risk everything for freedom, what we would be willing to endure to control our own destinies. We might think about the forms of oppression that still exist in our world, and the courage required to resist them. And we might remember that individual acts of courage, even when they seem impossible, can inspire movements and change history. Henry Box Brown climbed into a box measuring 3 feet by 2 feet by 2.5 feet. He endured 27 hours of suffering that few could imagine. He emerged on the other side as a free man. And in doing so, he became a symbol of resistance that would outlive him by generations. His story is a testament to the power of hope, the strength of human determination, and the eternal truth that the desire for freedom cannot be boxed up, no matter how tightly the lid is nailed shut. This is the story of Henry Box Brown, the man who mailed himself to freedom, and in doing so, helped to deliver a message about human dignity and liberty that still resonates today.